All right, we're live with the first ever episode of Bad Morning News. For those of you who see the little notification, I haven't posted this anywhere on social media because this is essentially a test episode. But to those of you who have notifications turned on because you've subscribed to my channel before, welcome. This is going to be essentially your antidote, your sort of reversal of morning news as it currently stands. If any of you are familiar with the morning news format, typically it's human interest stories, it's puppies, it's fucking babies laughing, and the latest, very tame internet video being talked about by people on a butter yellow couch with very little confrontation, very little, sort of harsh or negative thoughts, very little anything that would get you to rebel against the system as it stands. And they get you nice and complacent so that you can go to work and you can, fucking be a cog in the machine that day. So this is going to be a show that does the opposite of that. I've made the joke, and yes, it is a joke. But I would, find it fucking hilarious if somebody took it out of context because this happened. But the joke that that this is the news that people will listen to and then go shoot up their workplace instead of doing like productive shit while they're there. So that should give you an idea of the kind of thing that I want it to be. I want it to be sort of the way that you realize that the world is still what it is in the evening when that evening news comes in and tells you about how all the terrible stuff is happening. Because this is my channel and I'm an asshole. So just some housekeeping that I'll probably be saying at the beginning of this more regularly instead of this spiel at the beginning. Even though I'll probably be saying that until the end of the week just to explain to people who are new here what's going on. The program is brought to you by Brave Browser, the ad-resistant, tracker-resistant browsing experience. You can download that and directly support this show in the description. You can also download the Cash app, which also supports the show by giving you and me $5 when you send your first $5 over it. It's a cash and Federal Reserve, sorry, it's a cash, which Federal Reserve note, whatever. This is off to a brilliant start. It's a Federal Reserve note and Bitcoin wallet, and it also comes with a Visa card that you can order, that you can personalize and engrave and shit with whatever you want. And you can spend your stuff in store with that. And it's also brought to you by Liberty Mugs. Mugs you can use to piss off your coworkers while, shooting up the workplace sometime. So feel free to look at any of the links in the description. We'll also be posting our source links there after we're done. And if you're interested in being an anchor on this show, I'm looking for at least one from every major continent. So hit me up. It's going to be an hour-long show every single day, starting at around 4 p.m. his time, my current host, and about 8 p.m., 8 a.m. Pacific time. So that'd be 11 a.m. Eastern time. So feel free to look at any of those links. And without further ado, after my little rocky introduction there, let's let my co-host introduce himself and let people know who he is and where people can find him. This won't be a regular thing because, you should be able to get to know us like regular news anchors. And it won't interfere with the rest of my content production either. But generally, I just want you to get a feel for the first week in case you're new to this show, in case you're new to this channel, of who this co-host is. So, Lupin, why don't you take it away there?
My turn? Right, so hey everybody, I'm Lupinate, the Anarchic Wolf. You can find me on Steam as Anarchic Wolf or Minds and Discord as Lupinate. You can also find me on Google Plus as Daniel Hatfield. I write mainly about logic and reason in most cases, and a bit of independent reporting of news stories on some of those platforms as and when I find something that grabs my interest, usually bad news.
All right, cool. So you had a story about let's start with Brexit. I think that'd be a good thing to start with. So why don't you read a few paragraphs from your piece and let us know what your take is on it, because like I have my opinions about Brexit and how the referendum has not actually succeeded yet, but like I'll be stating those after we get the actual news story read.
I would agree with those because there's some interesting ones they could have brought up about Brexit, but they're a few days old, so I thought I'd leave them for now. So this is from today. From the express.co.uk, Italy finally wakes up to Brexit as officials admit EU black hole to impact 800,000 farms. Almost 1 million Italian farmers could be affected by a no-deal Brexit, with many fearing sales of Italian-made products and food would be cut by a black hole restricting free trade between the two countries. Roberto Monclavo, a president of the Italian farming union called Coldiretti, told Italian National Assembly yesterday the UK's exit from the EU in March 2019 would weaken Italy's farming industry and export trade. Coldiretti is the leading Italian union of farmers at a national and European level. It has offices in every region and province in Italy, with 724 offices and 5,000 regional sections in operation. But the president of the union warned Italian agriculture can't pay the price of Brexit. They fear an estimated cut of 2.7 billion euros, or 2.3 billion pounds in current money. That's now changed automatically, but hey, to the budget of the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, something which could heavily impact 800,000 Italian farms. Mr. Monclava said Brexit without a trade agreement would risk the country's ability to face key challenges for the country and for the EU itself, from climate change to immigration to security. He told the National Assembly, the proposal of the EU Commission on the first multi-annual budget after the exit of Great Britain weakens agriculture, the only truly integrated sector of the Union, and that means undermining the foundations of the EU itself at a particularly critical moment for his future. A choice, however, rightly rejected by the European Parliament as well, and by the same citizens of the Union who for 90% support the agricultural policy at the community level for the decisive role it has for the environment, the territory and health, according to the public consultation promoted by the European Commission itself. We need a more equitable distribution of resources, overcoming the imbalances that have characterized the past. Mr. Monclavo concluded his objective could be possible with external and internal convergence to make direct payments consistent with parameters such as production costs, labor, and added value, and by avoiding cuts. Meanwhile, the Italian media has also warned Britain, a key territory for Italian food exports, would have to kiss goodbye to a large percentage of its favorite foods, including olive oil, pasta, and more. Popular foods such as peppers, rice, herbs, spices would also be affected if the UK failed to secure a free trade agreement with Europe. Italian agricultural journal In Natural warned that Britons may have to say goodbye to Italian produce if the UK cannot maintain free trade agreements with the EU. In an opinion piece, the magazine stated that in the case of a no-deal Brexit, the tables of Britain will be decidedly poorer. It also suggested Britain should start buying non-perishable foods imported from the European mainland to avoid major shortcomings. It said that the risk could be likely if the UK seeks an intense agricultural trade flow with the United States to plug the black hole, but it also stated that importing US goods would be unhealthier than products produced on the continent. However, the trade journal said flour, oats, sugar, salt, and vinegar would not be affected by the collapse of free trade, and they're also produced in the UK. Additional reporting by Maria Ortega. And that's the end of it. Now,
Cool.
I can quickly give my view on Brexit, because it's currently a bit of a shit show, to be honest. Well, and that's being, to be quite frank, that's being polite at this rate. Some think tanks have done some analysis on Brexit under the Chequers deal. And in its current form, even with the amendments, it effectively makes Britain a bit of a vassal state and effectively the colony of Europe. And nobody in Britain is going to accept that. Not the people, at least. The politicians are quite happy to, but the people aren't.
Yeah, well, and because that, like, people fail to recognize the fact that the state is one of the barriers in the way of trade most of the time. And if you have a union that's unwilling to trade with somebody because they left that union, effectively you have a bunch of people who are like inconvenienced and largely blockaded from seeing their full business expansion potential. And I think that this is a really good example of that. And, you know, like, if anybody's seen the Brexit movie, all these regulations and tariffs and all that shit were one of the prime reasons that people wanted a Brexit to begin with. So I do wonder how much this will cement people's tendencies toward a stronger referendum, one that isn't weak, one that isn't compromised, and one that isn't, you know, cucked out by May.
Well, the only problem is May is Prime Minister, and she wasn't really a Brexiteer. She was a Remainer. So
right,
she's not really, there's never been a ideological interest in free trade for May. To be quite frank, from a British perspective, using that hat at the moment, she's a bit of a conservative in name only. Or a red Tory, as they call them over here. It's basically she's got so many liberal, and I use that word quite wrongly, to be honest, tendencies, that she wants to manipulate Brexit into being something that it never was meant to be, which was people want sovereignty over their island. And I can understand that. They don't want to follow rules from somebody that doesn't represent them. And I can understand that. And that is the predominant reason for Brexit. That and the fact that without those trade rules, we have the option of opening up our markets to the rest of the world. Italy likes to claim that it's the only source of a lot of its goods, and it isn't. There are thousands of markets out there for all sorts of produce and food. It is perfectly possible for Britain to tap those with a preferential agreement. And from the perspective of being able to negotiate, I have a much healthier belief in Britain's capability of doing that, having done so very well for itself for several thousand years. And I don't see it being benefited by being held back by a bunch of rules and regs that it didn't agree to in the first place. Only a bunch of bureaucrats did.
Well, and not to, like, it'd be sort of like if America refused to trade rice, because like the majority of Asian rice is imported. It's imported from places like America, specifically the West Coast, to the majority of Asia. Like Japan specifically, I think gets like 65% of their rice from America. And it'd be like if America started to isolate trade from them, and they were like stopped from being capable of eating rice. And to me, like, when you start to look at things like this on the way that they impact people on an individual level, and the fact that farmers can't just trade with whom they want because governments have a petty feud with one another, it really highlights the fact that the crown is not representative at all, no matter how healthy debate is, no matter how many people are jerking off in parliament. There's still plenty of people who are interested in a full, strong, uncompromised referendum, and plenty of people who are trying to fuck them over.
There's one thing I wanted to add as well with regards to some of the scaremongering that was actually in this article from the Express. The idea that Britain would suddenly be without food because only Italy can provide pasta, obviously. It's not like you can use flour, eggs, and a bit of salt to make it yourself at home, or that there's a burgeoning market for homemade baking and uh, the like. Or that also that there is quite a lot of shops in Britain that make it themselves.
Right.
So pasta isn't going to suddenly vanish. Olives won't suddenly vanish from the market. Other places grow olives. At the moment,
Of
with the heat
course.
wave we got, I think we could probably do some olive growing this year if we really wanted to.
Yeah, of course, this year. I mean, when you look at crop rotations, it has to have a certain amount of like repeatability in order to be
Now,
worth initial investments.
I was being facetious, though, mate. To
Yeah,
be
well, no,
fair,
no.
that last bit.
What I'm saying is they could probably get it from America or Brazil instead.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. It's not as if we don't export from those countries anyway to get the goods that people want year round. If
Yeah,
people want raspberries year round, you gotta order from the southern half of the planet for
yeah.
part of the year. It's just got to be done.
Well, and let's be specific. This is going to hurt Italy, not because
Oh
of
yeah.
Brexit, but because of the EU. So, if
Mm-hmm.
anything, it makes fucking the Brexiteers points.
Yep. Britain has and still will have an unbelievably strong arguing point. It is the fifth largest economy and it trades predominantly with Europe. If it stops trading with Europe, Europe will crumble within months. It is not a potentiality, it's a certainty at this point. It is too fragile. It cannot survive without a trade deal, which is part of the reason why Britain is being so flexible. They know that if Europe falls, it'll probably descend into war, and it doesn't want another warring European conflict going on. So it needs to come up with something to basically take up a responsible position in the world.
Right, and
Unfortunately, what it's being given is shit.
well, right, and a trade agreement is always preferable to war, especially since if you can get enough of them with enough interested governments, you don't have a war to begin with. Like that's pretty much what started off World Wars One and Two was the fact that massively irresponsible spending and essentially an economy off the rails started to take place in the powers interested nations like U.S. and in what would eventually become the UK. Um, so they needed a way to curtail all of the possible negative ramifications of essentially the roaring 20s. And what do you know, suddenly there were a couple wars they lied us into. So I would certainly prefer trade to war. I would prefer that people started to decentralize and localize, but I would certainly prefer trade to war, and I think that most other people would as well, which is why I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of friendly fascism, but it's the idea that you can control people effectively by getting them to accept their slavery, getting them to accept what they what they have to sacrifice in terms of freedom in order to get the good life, the calm life. And most people are willing to do that. Most people are willing to knuckle under as long as it still means they can get their Italian noodles and olives. But if there's a significant amount of people still interested in a strong referendum, even after they've been jerked around by May and essentially red people for a long time, then maybe this will see a positive upturn in interest for that because at the very least, like you said, they can make their pasta at home.
Well, the way I see it, at the bare minimum, there's now a huge market for any people of Italian birth and residency in Britain to create their own pasta stores or olive import shops and to potentially to get their olives from other sources than Italy or Greece or wherever it would be in Europe. And personally, I just don't see if Europe's going to have that much of a job crisis as a result of a huge black hole in their revenue stream, then one has to think that some of those sub-governments may wind up saying, fuck this noise, and just go ahead and get the actual trade straight out the bat directly with the UK separately from everybody else and violate the treaties. There's always that option if people think there is no will to enforce them.
Right. Well, and a little beyond that, like, if people are truly interested in, you know, a prosperous Britain, they'll realize that this trade needs to happen regardless of whether or not the EU wants it, and they'll tell their Italian neighbors that they need to get on board as well, because clearly, like, this makes an example of the EU being an organization of tyranny. So, like, I would not mind seeing an Italexit if that's a thing, like, in common parlance yet. But in terms of, like, because at this point I don't see a way around an Italexit. I don't see a way around them moving away from this current union that bars them from trading pasta of all things. Like, that's their chief export, if anything.
Well, that and very, very, very fast cars.
Well, okay, but that, I mean, so their fast cars are not really chief export. They're just they're just also there.
Yeah, true. But there's also things like, I mean, it's more than just agriculture for Italy, but it is a huge part of their market. I'm not going to deny that. There are some other major markets that are going to be heavily affected by London leaving. Simply things like Italian suits. Those are still very highly prized in Europe and other places of the world. If they suddenly lose a huge market access entirely, prices are going to go up around the world for those, and it's going to hit one of those very common cycles where the price rises so much that nobody buys it. So they have to raise the price to afford or to justify making any more suits. And even less people will buy them. And then they raise the price again. And this is a very common cycle in businesses that fail, is you constantly raise your prices to get your product to sell and make the same profit margin instead of lowering your prices and reducing your costs.
Right. Well, and so I looked it up. This is from tradingeconomics.com. I'm not exactly sure how reputable they are, but their chart is a chart from 1991 to 2018. And they claim that vehicles, machinery, and other manufactured goods account for, like, it looks like about 30%.
Okay.
And then chemicals, other transport means. And then there's, like, exports of coke and refined petroleum products, like 14.1%.
Like
yeah, so they've increased 14.1% over time. Wait, no, I'm reading this wrong. So their vehicle sales, okay, their vehicle, machinery, and other manufactured goods sales are down 30% essentially.
Okay. So it's, like, plastics that are most likely going to be hit instead of manufacturing. Okay. And agriculture, obviously, as they already highlighted, the fact that an 800,000 farm crisis is going to occur because there's nobody to sell to. It's going to create a huge surplus.
Well, and of course, like, in terms of agribusiness, you have a huge amount of possible negative ramifications in terms of that petroleum, because a lot of exports happen on the same ship. So if you're not shipping to the, like, essentially the UK, like Great Britain specifically, if you're not shipping to there your food, then you probably also won't be shipping your plastics, or at least not as cheaply. So Yeah.
Let's step away from that specific issue because I mean we can talk Britain for most of the show if you want. I've got quite a few, but that are fairly recent, all
Right.
kind of interconnected and showing why the government sucks.
Right. Exactly. Well, so let's switch gears then. I'm going to bring up the fact that it's the anniversary of Eric Garner's death, his
Here,
murder
here.
by the hands of cops. Eric Garner, for those of you who don't know, he was basically choked to death by cops who wouldn't let him breathe. He suffered from, I think, some cardiopulmonary conditions, and they wouldn't get off him. So the
Can
fact that they
and can I
go
quickly
ahead,
add as well? The crime that he was accused of was
yeah,
failing to pay illegal cigarette selling because he
right,
wasn't paying taxes on the cigarettes that he was selling. He'd sell individual cigarettes to people to try and make some money so he could survive. And instead of the government doing what it was supposed to do, apparently, which is to take care of this man and to treat him like an individual and a human being and to give him what he needed according to the state, they killed him for evading tax. And if anybody
right,
says otherwise, look at the reality.
right. Well, and so let me read this piece from the Free Thought Project. 4 years ago today, cops killed Eric Garner, and the only person in jail is the man who filmed it. While the man who filmed Eric Garner being choked to death by the NYPD, the cops responsible for his death are still getting paid. So this is by Matt Agrist at the freethoughtproject.com. It reads, 4 years have now elapsed since New York City police officer Daniel Pantaleo choked Eric Garner to death for the apparently egregious crime of selling loose cigarettes. But the only one related to the case who faced any punishment so far for what many believe to be a cold-blooded murder is the man who filmed it. In October of 2016, Ramsey Orta, the man who filmed Pantaleo choke the life from Garner, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for drugs and gun charges that were conveniently brought against him after he became famous for taking the video that fateful day. While Orta rots in prison, the officers responsible for the death of Garner remain free. Finally, however, this all may be about to change. On Monday, the New York Police Department announced that they've become impatient with the Justice Department's slow pace at its investigation into the death of the father of six. The NYPD announced that it would soon start disciplinary proceedings against the officers involved in the killing of Eric Garner, as federal action is absent. As the New York Times reports, the police department, acting one day before the 4th anniversary of Mr. Garner's death on Staten Island, said it would no longer hold off on disciplinary proceedings if the Justice Department had not announced by August 31st whether it will file criminal charges or not. Understandably, members of the public in general and the Garner family in particular have grown impatient with the fact that NYPD has not proceeded with our disciplinary proceedings, and they have difficulty comprehending a decision to defer a federal criminal investigation that seems to have no end in sight. Lawrence Byrne, the department's deputy commissioner for legal matters, said in a letter to the Justice Department on Monday. Byrne added that given the extraordinary passage of time since the incident without a final decision, any further delay in moving ahead with our own disciplinary proceedings can no longer be justified. According to the Times, the disciplinary proceedings would involve Officer Daniel Pantaleo, who was seen on a bystander's video holding Mr. Garner's neck as he begged for breath, as well as a Sergeant Kezia Adonis, who was one of the first supervisors at the scene. Sergeant Adonis had already been administratively charged for failing to properly oversee her officers, according to a senior police official who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss a personnel matter. The disciplinary proceedings against her, however, have paused pending the federal investigation. While this may seem like a step in the right direction to those who've been following the Garner case, there's little hope for any actual justice. Defying all reason, Pantaleo remains on the force, having faced no penalty for killing a nonviolent man who committed a crime under only the strictest legal definition of the term. And Orta, who filmed the gang of police protecting Like, yeah, protecting Pantaleo's action, preventing anyone from stepping in to allow Garner to breathe, is sitting in jail on ostensibly unrelated charges. Before he was sentenced, Norda claimed he'd been constantly harassed by the cops and repeatedly arrested since that day, almost certainly retaliation for exposing the brutal incident to the world. This lack of charges and discipline is in spite of the fact that Garner's family received a $5.9 million settlement with New York City, courtesy of the taxpayers in 2015. Marking another aspect of how police brutalize citizens with virtual impunity, as they aren't required to carry liability insurance even for the gravest of wrongdoings. Erica Garner, the victim's daughter, who became a tireless advocate against violent policing, sadly passed away late last year, knowing that there had still been no justice for her father. Appallingly, 4 years after Pantaleo slipped his arm around Eric Garner, pulled him to the ground, and strangled the last breath from his body, countless other murders of black men and others by police have been distanced much of the public at large. Have distanced much of the public at large from the horror. As Claire Bernice wrote 2 years ago, after there had still been zero justice for Garner, horrific police brutality and violence, and their impunity in committing obvious crimes have stifled this nation in every conceivable way. Sadly, 4 years later, we as a nation, tragically echoing Eric Garner, can't breathe. So that's that piece.
I mean, it sickens me, the fact that it's been a year? Yeah? No, more than a year. It's been at least 2.
Well, I mean, since Eric Garner?
Yeah.
4 years.
4. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, speedy trial that, eh?
4 years with no idea of what the state's excuse for this is going to be. It doesn't have one, which is why it's taking it 4 years to come up with one. There's no excuse for what was done. There's no excuse for brutally punishing people with death for enacting trade. Every single person involved should be stripped of any title, any authority that they once had. And there should be jail time going on here. This should be treated as any other murder.
Well, right, but the government doesn't have the same standards. You know, I
of course
posted.
not.
Yeah, well, because I posted on Twitter this morning that I'd love to see something like, I'd love to see, you know, this tweet about, you know, the fact that government should be held to the same standards as the public, gain some steam, you know, but I don't think it will. So,
no,
like,
probably won't.
Because most people don't fundamentally give enough of a shit to recognize that the system is the problem. Because it is. The system, it's a systemic problem. The police have their own protection, you know, and insulation from outside consequence. If there is an internal investigation done and, you know, any sort of punitive action is taken, like, the only reason anybody here, and I've made this point multiple times recently, but, like, I'll get into that a little later. The only reason anybody here would be punished is if one of them stepped out of line and they needed somebody to hang this around their neck. Like, it's something that happens frequently where somebody just, they have to bite the bullet because they stepped out of line. And I think that's the only time that any of these motherfuckers ever actually see any significant punishment. The other times they're just protected by unions and politicians and the blue line, you know. So it's relatively easy to see that the state does not have to deal with its own corruption. I mean, it's been 4 fucking years. No civilian, with very few exceptions, gets a 4-year wait before any, you know, before any sort of action is taken. Like, it's fucking absurd. There are death row inmates who've, like, had sentences that were long, but not as long as this. And I think longer than this, of course, but, you know, it's a relatively absurd time frame.
Oh yeah, of course. It's absolutely mental, but it should never have happened in the first place. We all know that, and that's why it's going to take this long.
Well, yeah, and, you know, I mean, to stick to that story, I'm going to read a few paragraphs, not the whole thing from this, but it's another Free Thought Project article. It says, cop charged after video shows him execute unarmed mother by shooting her in the head. A California police officer has been charged with manslaughter after he was caught on video executing an unarmed mother, shooting her in the head. So the article reads, Ripon, California. Mother and wife Evan Olson Yadigar had her life stolen from her last year by Stanislaus County Sheriff's Deputy Justin Wall, who publicly executed her for no reason. The senseless killing was captured on dash cam and was so unnecessary that Wall has just been charged with manslaughter. Evan Yadigar, according to her husband Hannibal, who was undergoing a manic episode due to her bipolar disorder on February 26, 2017. He explained that she never would have hurt anyone. It was merely trying to find a safe place after a confrontation with a hotel security guard. According to Sheriff Adam Christensen, the security guard reported that Evan Yadigar had begun an argument and a subsequent physical altercation occurred. When a deputy arrived, he saw Yadigar's vehicle pulling out of the lot. According to the release from the San Joaquin, I believe that's how you pronounce that, because I know there's Joaquin and then there's like probably also Joaquin, something like that. County District Attorney's Office. The killing came after a low-speed chase when Yadigar left the hotel during the argument with a security guard. On February 26th, Stanislaus County Sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the Modesto area Hampton Inn regarding a battery. Their description was given of a suspect who turned out to be Mrs. Yadigar. Mrs. Yadigar was located driving her Volkswagen sedan. When a deputy attempted to pull Miss Yadigar over, she failed to stop and led the deputy and eventually other law enforcement officers on a slow-speed pursuit that wound its way up to the city of Ripon. Deputy Wall was one of the pursuing vehicles. Ripon police joined in the pursuit. Once Miss Yadigar entered the city, the slow pursuit found its way to a neighborhood off Main Street where, for several moments, Miss Yadigar's car stopped. During an attempt to extricate Miss Yadigar from her car, she drove off again. At that time, Wall fired 4 shots at Miss Yadigar. None of the other officers at the scene fired their weapons. Life-saving measures were conducted by the officers at the scene until emergency medical personnel arrived. Miss Yadigar was pronounced dead when she arrived at the hospital. Miss Yadigar had succumbed to a single fatal wound. The DA's report made no mention of the officers being in danger during the chase because they were not. Although Miss Yadigar, 46, did put the vehicle in reverse, she did so briefly to drive around the cruiser blocking her path. So, always fun to hear about a completely unnecessary killing after also hearing about another one that took 3 years to even get to the stage of a punitive investigation. So that's the state of police brutality in America here.
Yeah, it hasn't quite gone that bad today in this day and age. And I mean, in Britain yet. It's gone bad. And I mean, it ties in well with the next set of articles I've got for over here, if I'm honest, because I'm not certain how much of these I can use due to the fact that they're from The Independent, which has a syndicate request form and all sorts of stuff to fill out if you want to do much with regards to reporting on them. So I can give you just the headlines if you want on these, or a very brief rundown and the link for people to actually go to.
Well, let's do the rape and domestic violence one first.
Yeah, I think that's what I was going to start with, because this is fresh today. They've done some statistics, and rape and domestic violence victim. This is the title from theindependent.co.uk. Rape and domestic violence victims at risk as police fail to record tens of thousands of crimes, Watchdog finds. Modern slavery victims who were forced into prostitution among victims whose cases were not properly reported. I'll give you a very brief rundown. Victims are being left at risk by police failures to investigate tens of thousands of crimes, including rape, violence, and domestic abuse, so Watchdog has warned. HM Inspectorate of the Constabulary, or HMIC, found that 1 in 5 crimes reported to the Lincolnshire Police were not being formally recorded, meaning they are not investigated and victims cannot access support. the Metropolitan Police failed to record almost 95,000 crimes in a year, 10% of its total, including violent offenses, domestic abuse, and theft. And then it comes out with a couple of additional reading options, which include police failing to solve 2/3 of knife crime, as figures saw. Meanwhile, misogyny should be classed as a hate crime, apparently, is something that's being campaigned for. So, in and amongst us not being able to actually solve the crimes we have on the books, we're not recording all the crimes that are actually happening in the first place. And we're demanding that even more crimes be added to the books, this time thought crimes. Anyway, in Humberside, the third force examined in a current round of inspections, around 85% of crimes were being recorded, so 15% are missing. The standard of recording has improved nationwide in the 5 years since the scandal over some police forces' no-criming offenses, including alleged rapes, by cancelling reports and eradicating them from statistics. So this was worse 5 years ago. But Her Majesty's Chief Inspectorate of the Constabulary said there was still work to do as its inspections of forces across England and Wales continue. I think I better stop there just in case we do wind up getting hit with anything for content infringement, because I don't want to cause any problems for you, mate. But I think that gives enough of a rundown, and if you want to read the rest of the article, it gets worse. You can go to the Independent and get it there.
Yeah, and we'll include all the links for these stories in the description. Could you go into detail on misogyny being added to a list? Is this sort of like what was that, Article 13, Title 13?
No, this is not. Title 13 has to do with
gender representation.
No, Title 13 has to do with copyright. So after that point, us doing this at all could get us sued for thousands.
I'm talking about in Canada.
Oh, in Canada, it's Bill C-16.
Yeah,
no, not quite. That's particularly focused on transgendered pronouns. You have to use, by law, the transgendered person's pronoun of choice or individual person's pronoun of choice. So if somebody identifies as male, even if they don't have the proper equipment to make that claim, then you have to declare them as male. And if they don't identify as he, you have to identify as whatever pronoun they're using, of which there are like 70.
Well, right. What I'm suggesting, so is this, because I hadn't heard about this misogyny thing. What is that?
Okay, so this is from this week, basically technically last Monday. This is a campaign group with regards to things like the Me Too movement. So it's signed by the Fawcett Society, the Civil Society Alliance Citizens UK, senior faith leaders, and the non-government organizations to vote as a vote to record misogyny as a hate crime nationwide in its upcoming meeting on the 11th of July. So, yeah, they're basically trying to make misogyny a hate crime, but via activism. And the hate crime laws over here are the ones that basically have predominantly been used to prevent abuse. I don't like using that word in regards to this, but to prevent online abuse. And it is becoming endemic in Britain that you can be tried for a hate crime very, very easily just by what you say on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. The problem is that the law is very vague, or it's deliberately so. It basically means that if you cause offense to somebody, then you have committed a crime. if it is then determined that you did it because of hate. And that interpretation has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the victim. So this is one of those never think the victim is wrong concepts, and that precludes that you are guilty of a crime without being able to prove your innocence. And even if you do prove your innocence through things like context or anything like that, because you said those words, you are liable. So it is literally thought crime. And to treat misogyny under this, which is now such a broad label in modern parlance, I don't quite know how it's going to be enforceable in a realistic manner.
Well, I mean, it's going to be enforceable because they don't need to worry about enforcing it. Like, and that sounds like a weird thing to say, but realistically, once people get used to their thoughts being controlled, they'll self-police. They don't
to a point. There is a limit to any amount of self-policing, because if people can't express themselves without being put in prison, they will go to violence because they cannot express themselves in an intelligent way anymore. And they have to agree, and that will drive people to violence. It's happened before here.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Like, it like the enforcement mechanism will be essentially people's fear of being charged under this. I mean, like, let's be specific. You've been on this channel before, and you know, hesitated to say certain things because of what happened to Marcus Meacham. So,
oh yeah, of course.
So, I mean, there's going to be a decent amount of people who do the same thing, and pretty much in every possible scenario.
But this is the problem. It doesn't matter what you say. Anybody can take offense to anything. Communists and socialists take offense to me supporting capitalism every day of the week. So there's no reason ideological hate crime won't be next. We've currently got a huge, I mean, the government did a press release a couple of weeks ago saying that they were creating call centers and think tanks on how to tackle Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in Britain.
Right.
Now, I would like people in America who are used to these stereotypes to ponder that for a moment. They are heavily penalizing Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And which are the two most Islamophobic groups and which are the most Islamophobic groups and anti-Semitic groups stereotypically? Just think on that for a minute and then have an inward chuckle at the ridiculousness of all of this. It's basically playing race war and trying to find a way to make it, I don't know, illegal to have one while at the same time promoting it. It is very odd.
Definitely. Well, and also, like, I think that everything has a precedent, and everything also has like a possibility of examples being made. So like Americans could say something similar to, you know, well, at least like my speech may be being controlled in X way, but at least I don't live in the UK. And I think that that's what this sort of thing is. Like, the more you look at the world as a tax farm, the more it starts to look a whole lot like a bunch of different pens with varying levels of freedom, where the average person is just like, you know, competing with other sort of similar and same class people across the world for who seems to be the most fucked. And the person who seems to be the least fucked is the person who can be said to be free, even though they might not be free at all. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs when, you know, you can compare something like the UK criminalizing thought and criminalizing jokes and, you know, throwing somebody in prison for filming outside of a courthouse, you know, and that can be considered freer than somewhere else, or less free than somewhere else, so that place can justify their tyranny. Like, you know, fucking Americans saying, you know, well, we're freedom owning you, like Mr. Medicare fucking posting that sort of shit on his page.
Yeah. which always gets me because it's so poignant.
Well, I mean, it is until you realize things like the Eric Garner case are still 4 years old.
Yeah, I'm not denying that. Once you have the balance of, well, we ain't so great either, mate. Um, it's yes, you've got over here. Have you got a license for that coming up? And you've got you can't. You've got basically Minority Report levels of thought crime going on. But at the same time, you've got the same thing in the US, and people don't even know it half the time.
Right.
They engineer crimes because they want to, like, the FBI will physically engineer major crimes to occur in order to stop them before they occur and meet quotas that they need to hit. This is the whole point. They manufacture things that they can solve because they created them. And people don't pay attention to that.
And this sort of bureaucracy, and also I think somewhat things like the EU, were what the Vogons were designed after in Hitchhiker's Guide. So it's always interesting to remember that people have hated this sort of thing for years.
Oh, of course. It's the idiotic bureaucracy of it all. The fact that you need to go through all of these massive hoops just to basically supply anything to anyone. And it's a pain in the ass. It really is, especially for anybody who has a small business. Right. They've got to deal with so many things. And at the same time, you've got two major problems. You've got, with regards to race in Britain, there was a few years back a report, I think it's called the Stevenson Report, which there were two reports, one which came out directly after the Brixton riots, which said that there were incidents of racism amongst officers, specific ones, but not systemic. And it was like certain training needed to be done to make sure these people would improve upon it. And the next one that came out basically said that it was a systemic problem, and it was to do with the Stephen Lawrence case. The report that came on after that basically accused the British police of being racist. and it formally did it because it was an investigation. Yeah. And it formally accused the entire structure as being endemically flawed. So they had to change how they do policing over here, or in particular, how they promote people.
Right. So, yeah, I remember hearing about that.
Yeah. So there's basically a fast track. If you're a minority and you're in business and you've got a good managerial capability, you can join the police force as basically as a mid-level police officer with no beat training whatsoever. Yeah. It used to be that everybody had the training and they'd come up through the ranks like you'd expect from that kind of system. But now that you've got this sort of jumpstart method, they basically loaded a bunch of diversity in. Brilliant, wonderful. These guys don't know how to do police work, but they balance the numbers out brilliantly and they can pick it up surely. What they picked up was they did what they did in business. They created quotas, they created targets, they created things that needed to be filled in order to achieve a goal. And if you have, over here, it's a little bit perverse. If you've got a predominantly white community, for example, with a few black people in it, and the crimes are occurring within a small area, that level of crime, it needs to be balanced for the demographics. So they will charge people with hate crimes, for example, for using the N-word, even when they were the victim of an attack of something. And this has happened. This was reported in, I think, the Mail. But this was a few weeks back. And basically what what went down is I think some farmer was being accosted by a gang of youths. They were a different skin tone. They used the N-word at him. He used it back at them. This was after he had been assaulted by them and was trying to defend his property from them and from his family being harmed by them. He had called the police. Then the youths called the police after he used an offensive word. The police arrested him and did not arrest the youths because there were more crimes they could accuse that one man of than they could accuse the youths of.
Yeah.
Because he was involved in an assault as well. So the victim of an actual crime, a violent crime.
Well, an actual crime.
Yes,
like if we're speaking ethically.
Yeah, an ethical crime. That person is now being put through the court system and being forced to deal with getting a lawyer and the rest of it, and expending huge amounts of capital just to prove his good name is still good. Right. And that principle is rapidly making Britain less secure. You don't feel, I mean, people, there's another article I've got from the Mail, if you want me to divert to that one.
Well, let's actually bring that up tomorrow because we're rapidly approaching the end of the show. Let's mention a few things in comments and get your perspective on it, and then we'll wrap up this episode.
Well,
Kara says, considering how little they investigate knife crime, they may make it safer to stab someone than insult someone. So, I think that's a fair point.
That is a fair point. I think at this rate, it is rapidly becoming apparent that they are more interested in protecting people's feelings nowadays under the law than they are protecting people from actual harm. And it's this is one of the major reasons why there are so many people in the internet or the online independent Gamergate system, I guess, basically the best way of putting it. Those who were in Gamergate are openly coming out against this sort of nonsense, right. Especially the British ones. That's why 4 internet superstars of Britain have moved to join a political party at UKIP. Yeah. That is... People like to go, they're making it alt-right. No, they really aren't. They're making it conservatively liberal, effectively. They're bringing in the classical liberal option. And that's why I say it's conservative, because it's basically a 17th century school of thought that should have been retained for all time. Individuals are primary in any calculation you want to make. And if you don't make them primary and you defer to the group, your calculations are going to be wrong, always. It's never going to work.
All right. Well, I think that's a relatively good place to wrap it up. This will be every day at, and it's going to be earlier. It's going to be every day at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Well, sorry, not 11, fucking 10 a.m. Eastern time. And if you're in Britain, it'll be at 4 p.m. your time. So feel free to tune in. And if you're interested in anchoring, let us both know, and we'll hit you up. Either one of us will at least get the conversation started. Because I want to have like an anchor from every continent if possible, or at least as close to that paradigm as I can get. But feel free to suggest news stories. This is going to be posted to my social media shortly so that people can know about this sort of thing happening. It's going to be an hour long every day because like my other streams were way too long for a lot of people. So I figured that I'd get something like this going. And also I'm going to be doing some regular like specific content. But this is going to be a daily news show, so you can use this as your antidote to the morning news, and obviously shoot up your workplace. So anyone who is interested in sending us news stories, please feel free to do so, and we will try to cover them on a regular basis. This has been Jeremiah and Lupinit. You got anything to say?
Yeah, just a reminder, guys, you can find me on Minds in particular and on Discord under Lupinite.
Cool. All right, so this has been an episode of Bad Morning News. So bad morning to y'all, and hope you have a really bad day. Be well.
See y'all.